today I'll be, like I said, I'll talk about primarily, continuing discussing like early British history. We'll mostly talk about the Stuart dynasty today. Yeah, I'll get to, of course, later getting into the subsequent, English Civil War. I did want to talk about first a little bit about, of course, William Shakespeare, who I'll, of course, get into today. We'll just, spend a few minutes on him, a little biography on him. Shakespeare was born, they think, in 1564. There's kind of a debate about when he was born. I think it's, they said April the 23rd. I think they're kind of disputed about that. They do think he was Christianed, William Shakespeare, on April 26th. That's when he was baptized, so that they know. So that's probably pretty much close to being accurate as a whole. And also Hope is joining us this morning. So good morning, Hope. Hope you're doing great out there. But Shakespeare, of course, would go on to, of course, go to London, where he would become, he was an actor originally. In fact, he was, I think, 35 when he became an actor, which is, pretty old for that time. And then over time, he became such a success with, I guess, writing plays that he basically formed his own theater, which was called different names. I think the original name that they called it was the Globe Theater. That's the common name that they often dub it. Although it was actually originally called the Lord Chamberlain's Men, I think was the common name. And of course, if you know about it, like during that time, when they had plays, it was all done by either men or boys. There was no women that would do the female parts in a play. So you'd have sometimes younger boys might do like Juliet or something like that. And there was two Globe Theaters. There was one you see there, the first one founded in 1599. They talked about in the video. That one actually burned down 1613, in the middle of a play. The building caught fire and burned down. And then they had the other one too, which reopened in 1614. That one was closed by the Puritans, a little later and all that. So, yeah, Shakespeare is kind of important. They kind of refer to the period of like Shakespeare under Queen Elizabeth and King James I, when he wrote most of his plays, as being the so-called Shakespearean era. So it's kind of this golden age of England we kind of talked about. Shakespeare wasn't the only play. You may have heard of Christopher Marlowe, who was contemporaneous to him. I think was maybe better, but died young. So you may have emulated him more or less. And then also Shakespeare, you saw, was also like a poet, like writing sonnets primarily. I do have, let's see, a little slide, of course, on Shakespeare. Those are, of course, some of all the plays that he wrote. He wrote 37 plays, and there was one, I think, a 38th one he never completed, I believe. But yeah, Romeo and Juliet, that's probably considered one of the greatest, up there with Hamlet, Macbeth, Julius Caesar as well. You can see other ones, Merchant of Venice, A Midsummer Night's Dream, Henry IV, Henry V. He wrote one on Henry VIII. Richard III is another one that he wrote. Much Ado About Nothing, Twelfth Night is another one. I think I had a list of them here, but like just about all of them. But The Taming of the Shrew, I don't think they mentioned that one as well. Othello was another one you may have heard of that he did as well. They don't mention, looks like King Lear. Yeah, King Lear was one you may have heard of. He did a version of Oedipus Rex as well. That was well known. There's also another you may have heard of called As You Like It. It's like a bunch of them that he had, that he did that was well famed. So which one's the most famous? I know, I think they seem to think that Romeo and Juliet, I think, is pretty big. And I think Hamlet, I think those are the two big ones. He did a lot of tragedy type plays, which were real popular because of, I guess, going back to Greek Roman times and all that. But they started to get away from a lot of the medieval stuff, and they start trying to create more modern plays, more or less. So that's who William Shakespeare was and all that. There's the Globe Theater, of course, little slide on that overall. So yeah, we're going to go ahead and, of course, move on, of course, to talk about the Stuart dynasty, which I kind of had already talked about before. We'll, of course, get into and discuss the reign of, King James the First, who comes in, who, of course, becomes the, the main king and all that. So I'll talk about a little background on James. James, as you remember correctly, had become the ruler of Britain after Queen Elizabeth died. Anyway, Elizabeth died, I think she was like 69 when she died. That was in 1603. And of course, the throne went to Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots' son, who was the King of Scotland, who was known actually as, they called him King James VI, who had been ruling in Scotland since basically the 1560s. I think 1567 was the year. So he came over, he became the first king of what we call Great Britain, the United Kingdom, which was England and Scotland combined. I told you later, United Kingdom includes also Wales and Northern Ireland, although Ireland was originally included in it as well. So yeah, here's the Stuart family. You can see the House of Stuart, which you got there. So they're descended through back to Mary, Queen of Scots, and her second husband, which was Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. You can see there. And then you can see James came down, which is right here. He, of course, was married to what is Anne of Denmark, right here. Also had a sister named Elizabeth over here. You can see, which I'll maybe mention about her later. But I thought, well, did have a sister named Elizabeth. I'll get to that in a second. But Elizabeth was, of course, his second cousin right here. But Charles I, of course, his main son that he has. Actually, it's daughter I want to talk about later, which is Elizabeth. But and then Charles II, the grandson, and then his other grandson, James II. So basically, he's got what is really three main grandkids that become eventually rulers of Great Britain, which is later. Get into, of course, to talk about King James, who you see a picture of on the right. James, of course, in the Stuarts are kind of controversial. The reason why is the Stuart family was very pro-divine right. It's one thing that kind of gets them in a lot of trouble, of course, with Parliament. So it's going to eventually lead into what is the English Civil War. Both believe that the king, the monarch, should have, absolute power, could even, enact laws or decrees, basically like we've seen before, like in Europe. And some that they kind of get the loggerheads, and there's, multiple cases where both James and his son, Charles I, of course, actually, dissolved Parliament like multiple times. I think James did it a couple times also as well. And so there was kind of a lot of conflict between them. And some of it wasn't just about that. It was also about financial reasons, money issues, I think, between James and Parliament. And James was very extravagant. He liked to spend a lot of money, which he did on his budget, like his royal budget for, I guess, his court and all that. Like he spent a lot of money on that, which is true about that. Now, there are some famous events I did want to talk about with King James. James is probably considered one of the most famous of the monarchs of the Stuarts that you have. Probably that and maybe King Charles II overall. And his wife was Queen Anne of Denmark, who, of course, had two children, which, of course, Charles I, and I was trying to get to, of course, Elizabeth, I was thinking of, not his sister, but his daughter, Elizabeth of Bohemia, that you see on the bottom right there. There was some kind of tensions between Anne and James. I don't think she ever really liked her husband or something like that. They had kind of a bad relationship. I know of that. There's actually, it was an attempt by a bunch of Catholic conspirators, eventually in 1605, right after he became king, to have him murdered, which was, you may have heard of this, the so-called gunpowder plot, which happened, they think, in November of 1605. November 5th is when it kind of became known as a whole. And I believe I have a slide on that I can share with you. But the gunpowder plot, there he is, another slide on James. But the gunpowder plot was something involved a bunch of Catholic conspirators. They think some of them were also Jesuits, and included several men. One named Robert Catesby, who was famous. You may have heard of Guy Fawkes, which, of course, the most famous individual associated with it. And they wanted to overthrow James, like murder him, and put James's daughter on the throne, Elizabeth, thinking that she would be more sympathetic towards Catholics in the country, because the Catholics couldn't really practice their religion much under Anglicanism. I think they wanted to reopen churches there and even have like Catholic schools and things like that. And so they came up with this idea in November of 1605 to bring gunpowder barrels into the House of Lords, where James was getting ready to have a speech. I think that day, November 5th, they were going to blow them up. So I think they at one point smuggled something like 36 gunpowder barrels in there. But what happened was a bunch of the men were caught, including a man named Guy Fawkes, who you may have heard of. And so the plot was, uncovered, and the king was saved. And so later on, Guy Fawkes Day, or Guy Fawkes Night, as they call it later, became this annual celebration that they would, of course, do later, just called all kinds of names. I think Bonfire Night is a common name that they also do, where they light bonfires and they burn effigies of Guy Fawkes and all that. I don't know if this is as popular as it used to be in Britain now, because Britain's changing a lot over the years. But it's something that's very famous. And you may have seen that movie called V for Vendetta. I think it kind of associated with that and all that, which is kind of an interesting story. Now, other things that James is known for, too, I'll kind of talk about as well. James also was known for setting up a lot of colonies as well, which I guess his most famous colony that he established, you've probably heard about, is the Jamestown Colony. Everybody's heard of that, which eventually founded what they call Virginia, which became eventually one of the first of the American colonies that'll be set up later that you have. And, of course, the reason for why the British tried to do this, of course, was because of the Spanish. The Spanish were trying to take over North America and Latin America. And, of course, they had been finding gold everywhere, if you know about this. And so the English thought they could do the same thing. And so that's why they basically they created this joint stock company called the Virginia Company of London, which created it. And so the first colonists came over in 1607. They established a colony where the James River is in the eastern part of Virginia, not that far from Williamsburg, basically. And like I said, it actually didn't do well. I know if you probably heard the story of John Smith and Pocahontas, which is often associated with that early period in American colonialism. But it actually succeeded because of tobacco. They discovered tobacco. They started cultivating it and all that. A man named John Rolfe, you may have heard of, discovered it. And anyway, that was why it became successful. And so over time, Jamestown grew into what became Virginia later, one of the 13 colonies, which will be up there, with like Massachusetts as some of the first ones that'll be established. Like the Puritans and Pilgrims go into Massachusetts and settle there as well. And that's later part of what is the United States of America when they break away with the American Revolutionary War, which will be later, of course, in the 18th century that you have. Some other things he did colonize-wise. So they're starting to spread and become like an empire, the British at this point. But they also went into Northern Ireland. They created what they call the Plantation of Ulster, you may have heard of, which was established in the early 1600s, about 1609, roughly. And so you start seeing some of the British go over there into Northern Ireland. Anyway, a lot of the people that go there, like I think by the 1690s, you start seeing Scottish people immigrating from Scotland into Northern Ireland. And of course, if you know about it, they become known as the so-called Ulster Scots, or I think in America they call it later the Scots-Irish as well, that you've got there. And so that whole northern area of Scotland kind of becomes Protestant, and then the rest of Ireland's Catholic. And so that creates a lot of conflicts later that you have between the Irish and the Protestants. Like you had that famous war between the Irish Republican War they had, for years in modern times. The IRA, Irish Republican Army, fought, of course, against the English to have more independence and all that. And Ireland will eventually break away. I think around like World War I or so, they'll eventually break away and form like the Republic of Ireland that they have. They also colonized Bermuda. You don't forget about that, but as well. But basically, Bermuda, I think, in Jamestown, were your first colonies that were set up, pretty much by the English. Yeah, they also had the King James Bible, a King James version of the Bible. That was, of course, something else you probably heard about that he was also very, very famous for as well. That was completed in 1611, as you can see there. There's been, of course, previous English Bibles before that, like the Tyndale Bible, of course, I told you about previously, which was incomplete. They also had the King Henry VIII's Bible they had as well. He had one originally as well, which was, I think, not as good. And this one, of course, was a version which his basically members of the Anglican Church, like the clerical officials, helped develop it. And it was a Bible which was created from the oldest, manuscripts, like the Greek manuscripts were developed, for the New Testament, like the Greek Bible. And then like the Old Testament sections, of course, were also from like the Hebrew old Bible and like the Torah and all that. And I think he also had the Apocrypha was also added in there too, between the two Bibles there, the New Testament and the Old Testament. And of course, it is famous for its Old English being used. So if you read it today, I think most of them still have the thee, thy, and thou in it and all that, which was common for that time period. That's how the way people spoke, and so on. People don't do that much anymore, So anyway, that's something. And of course, it's one of the most widely published Bibles in the world. I don't know how many they published or whatever, but not as many as Shakespeare's books, but maybe. But Shakespeare's got like, must have been 1 billion books published for him, I know, because it's been published in so many languages, that kind of thing. So probably millions of copies, been published pretty much in different versions of it. All right. So anyway, of course, I'm going to move on. James would be in power until about, I think it's like he dies in 1625, James, that we're looking at here. Or we can go this one right here if you want that picture right there. And at the end of his reign, he became ill. I don't know if you know much about that. Of course, there's all kinds of stories about James I will mention about him that's well known. He was often he had a nickname. People called him the wisest fool in Christendom. If you know that was one of his nicknames he was called. But he was actually kind of highly intelligent. He wrote a couple books, if you know about this. He wrote one book about witchcraft. It was called Demonology, which is interesting because they had some kind of problems with witchcraft. I think it was in Scotland. He investigated it and he wrote a book about it and all that, because witchcraft and witch hunts were big at the time in Europe. He also wrote a book about it was about tobacco, which he thought tobacco was an evil thing because it was first starting to come out and bad for you and stuff like that. And so he wrote a book about it, being against it. It's being developed and cultivated and all that. He was known for being bisexual. That's something they always talk about. He had lovers. In fact, his court favorite was a man named the Duke of Buckingham, who was also one of his commanders or generals under him, the George Villiers, his real name. And he helped basically run his court when James was ill. And then when his son came in and was king at the beginning, he was pretty much his regent for, I think, the first 3 or 4 years of his reign. They used to have a joke about King James on the streets of London. They used to say, Elizabeth was king, now James is queen. So they thought he was weak. And I think that some people knew about him being like gay, because he actually, I think he said publicly one time that he loved the Duke of Buckingham, which is kind of, back then, if you said that, you might get killed, if you were considered gay, homosexual. So anyway, I'll get into, of course, his son, of course, we'll get to next. Of course, I'm going to, of course, be getting into the English Civil War today and talk about Charles I, who, of course, is the one that causes the English Civil War to break out later on, which will be in the 1640s when that of course happened. So I'll talk about Charles I, and who he was, and all that. And a little background about Charles a little bit before we get started. He reigned from 1625 to 49. So the second Stuart ruler. He was the son, of course, of James I and Anne of Denmark. Of course, I talked about originally. And let me get to that in a second about what caused it. He had a bunch of controversies. One big controversy he had was his wife. A lot of people didn't like his wife. His wife was Henrietta Maria, who was the daughter of Henry IV. He was also the sister of Louis XIII, who would later be king, and father of Louis XIV and all that. And that was real controversial. So some people thought maybe he was sympathetic toward the Catholics. He had 2 sons that were Charles II, James II, which were kind of also somewhat sympathetic to Catholics as well, especially James II, who will actually convert and all that. And his whole reign, led to conflicts with Parliament, which he'll close down Parliament like a bunch of times, which leads to that. And he's famous, like I said, for causing the English Civil War to break out, which, started in 1642. And it wasn't really fought over him, like who the actual king was. But the reason why they fought the English Civil War was because they debated on what kind of rule the king should have. Should he be an absolutist, like in Europe? It's going on like under Louis XIII, like Richie Lou and all that, or Louis XIV later that you have. Or they want a limited monarchy where Parliament representation, has more power, over the king and all that. So that was pretty much the main reason of why they fought. It was also religious reasons too, as well. I think it was like, the Catholics, you got the Anglicans, you got the Presbyterians in Scotland and all that, and that's kind of an issue also as well. That's involved in the whole English Civil War as well. And it wasn't really one war; it was like 3. There were 3 English Civil Wars, which I'll try to kind of go through and explain today. Now, let me talk about next. Of course, there was an issue that happened that really caused the whole English Civil War to break out. It was over this thing called the Petition of Right, which you may have heard about this before. And what happened was Charles was trying to kind of govern himself, like raising his own taxes and even his own decrees and things like that, which Parliament didn't think he could do that. That was something legitimate. This is kind of like almost going back to the time of King John with the Magna Carta in the Middle Ages and all that. And so in 1628, what happened was the Parliament attempted to limit Charles's powers as king with what is called the Petition of Right, issued that year, 1628. It did a lot of things, not just that. It restricted basically royal taxes we're talking about, like the king passing taxes. That they believe that only Parliament should be able to control revenue, in the country and all that, not to be able to, tax people to death, things like that. Also, the king had been issuing like martial law, which they didn't think he had a right to do either, except through Parliament. Also, the king was quartering troops in people's houses, especially in time of peace, which it was, I think, at the time. They thought that was illegal too. Also, he was imprisoning people without cause. And so they think that was illegal as well. So they had to have a reason to basically imprison people and things like that. And so they issued this. And what happened was in 1629, he came back and decided that he had had enough of Parliament. And so he closed it down. He abolished it, locked it basically up. And so for the next 11 years, 1629 to 1640, he reigned without Parliament. And so there's all kinds of nicknames they call that period, in British history, the so-called 11 years tyranny of Charles I, the personal rule of Charles I. So those are all kinds of names they called it. And so during that time, you see Britain basically coming very close to having an absolutist type government, like you're starting to see like in France and other countries in Europe. So yeah, they were kind of going that way. We're trying to go that way, more or less. Now, the only thing is, though, was that he didn't really have enough money to run the government. That was one of the problems with King Charles. So he continues to struggle with Parliament over financial issues, and this was all kind of going on at the time. You had the 30 Years' War going on, where he wanted to kind of fight in against the Germans and against the Spanish as well. So that was an issue that he had to deal with. And he lacked money, for the military and all that. Also, there was a war that broke out called the Bishops' War. That was one of the big ones. I think they talk about the Bishops' War, which broke out about 1639 to 1640. And if you know about in Scotland, they had converted to Presbyterianism, the Presbyterian Church or Church of Scotland, John Knox helped develop. And anyway, in Scotland, they didn't want to have like bishops, like episcopacy, like bishops and priests. They had what they call presbyters, which are these church elders that ran the church. And England wanted to put episcopacy in Scotland. They wanted to have Anglicanism there. So you got Presbyterianism versus Anglicanism. That's one of the issues that you have between the two sides. And so one of the things that Charles, by the way, did to raise money was he started raising taxes on a lot of the ports. They called it ship money. Yeah, ship money. And then he started taxing everybody, London and other cities, trying to get money and stuff like that. It was supposedly for like the Navy and stuff like that, ship money. And I think he didn't have enough, though, wasn't enough money, revenue. So what happened was in May of 1640, he recalled Parliament again. And this became known as the so-called Short Parliament because it met for about 3 weeks in May of 1640. They wouldn't do what he wanted, so he closed them down again. So a second time, closed them. And then he reopened another parliament, of course, which is the so-called Long Parliament. The Long Parliament would meet from 1640 to 1660. However, what happened over time, between 1640 to 42, he came to loggerheads, not with the Presbyterians, but with the Puritans. Of course, there's a lot of Puritans in England. And I haven't really talked about the Puritans, but the Puritans were members of the Anglican Church that wanted to purify it of any kind of Catholicism. That's why they're called Puritans. And you've heard of the Pilgrims, which are kind of similar to them. They're kind of like separatists that wanted to break away from them. So there are a lot of those members in there, like Oliver Cromwell, you may have heard of later, who's kind of famous, later in the English Civil War. they start, causing a lot of problems for him as well. And so at one point, what happened was it got to a loggerheads in January 1642, and Charles actually sent troops into the House of Commons to try to arrest members of Parliament, mostly Puritans. Anyway, he was accused of treason, I guess, for trying to overthrow the Parliament and all that. And so he was forced to basically escape to the north because mob violence broke out in London right after that. And so that basically began the so-called English Civil War. And so England basically divided up into opposing sides in the war, which will be, of course, multiple sides. And most English civil wars tend to have, multiple sides in a war. I'll kind of get into that. But the English Civil War was not one war. It was actually three. There were three English Civil Wars, which I'll show you on the screen there. First English Civil War, they had the Second English Civil War, and they had the Third English Civil War. They do have a nickname for the wars. I think some of the people in Britain still call it the War of the Three Kingdoms. They're talking about England, Scotland, and Ireland, kind of fighting it out. Some people also call it the English Civil Wars or the British Civil Wars. So it's also called that. There's different debates on when the war ends and all that, but they definitely know it started in 1642. But the bulk of the war goes up to 1648. But there was a third English Civil War that lasted till 1651 that they had. Now, who were the opposing sides, of course, in the war? You may have heard about these two different sides. I think it was actually more than two, but these were the two main sides that were primarily in the war. They usually call them first, they had the royalists on one side, which were nicknamed the Cavaliers, okay? And then, of course, you also had the so-called parliamentarian side, or parliamentarians, which, of course, were called the so-called Roundheads, that they were dubbed. And why were they called that? Well, obviously royalists, because they supported the king, the King Charles I, more or less. Cavalier is a term for someone who's kind of wealthy, basically upper class. And so a lot of the nobility, wealthy landowners, these are the ones that supported basically the royalist side. You can see the Anglican Church was kind of supportive of them a little bit too. The Catholics were, of course, there as well. You can see they even looked differently. The Cavaliers were known for having long shoulder-length hair and all that right there. And then you had some Catholics supporting them too, because some of the Stuarts, of course, were supportive of basically the Catholics. Then the Roundheads, they were called that because it had a lot to do with their helmets. It had this kind of round shape to it, although some people debate that it may have been also because of their haircuts. There's a theory that they would put the helmet on their head and maybe cut their hair or whatever around it, like a bowl cut or something like that. Some people claim that as well. But you can see a lot of the less well-to-do people, of course, were fighting on the other side. Small landowners, town-dwelling manufacturers, a lot of your Puritans were involved. In fact, the Puritans were a lot of the officers that actually fought on the Roundhead side. Of course, the greatest general that fought on the Roundhead side, of course, was Oliver Cromwell, who was, of course, also a member of Parliament. These were the actual generals that were big. Like the actual general that was the top general they had was Sir Thomas Fairfax, who people called him Black Tom because he had kind of a dark complexion. He'll lead an army later that'll be called the New Model Army, and that'll be, of course, the famous army which will be basically on the parliamentarian side. And Oliver Cromwell, of course, was the other one, of course, who became really the most famous general of the whole war on the parliamentarian Roundhead side. he's pretty much considered a military genius, although his political career later isn't as popular, if you know about that. Most of the officers that ran the New Model Army or parliamentarian armies were called grandees, which I think was a term that evolved from, I think, the Spanish originally. Cromwell, who I have an image of, I got a couple images of Cromwell, I believe. Here's the main one right here I've got right there. He, of course, like I said, became one of the main leaders, of course, of the parliamentarian forces during the war. He was called all kinds of nicknames. They called him Old Ironsides because during the war he led a cavalry unit on the parliamentarian side, which was called the Ironsides. It was a armored cavalry that was pretty good. And so they gave that name because he was kind of an older guy. They also called him Puritan Moses because he was very religious. And he really believed that soldiers would fight better if they believed in God and were very religious. I think he said something like, I believe that he that prays best fights best, was his famous quote that he's well known for. But yeah, he was a member of Parliament. They think he was a descendant of Thomas Cromwell, who was, by the way, one of, I think, the Lord Chancellors under Henry VIII. So he's got a kind of a interesting lineage that goes back to the time of the Tudors. And but he's a controversial figure. As you know, later after the war, he would take over as like a dictator of the country, so-called Lord Protector, as they called him. Now, one of the things, of course, that happened in the English Civil War, of course, I'll get to Cromwell in a second about it, but eventually they'll capture King Charles I. That's one thing that eventually will happen, of course. But like I said, the parliamentarian side would develop a professional army, which would be known as the so-called New Model Army. And this particular army was considered one of the first major professional armies that the British would have. And it fought all over the place, fought mostly in England, but it went into Scotland, invaded Scotland. It went into Ireland at one point as well. So it was like one of the armies that really fought all over the world at one point. Because most like armies before have kind of fought locally, you know, or things like that, you know, throughout England. This particular army, I'm going to have like later a documentary later. I'll show you a video clip of it, not today, but likely probably on like Thursday. But they fought with all kinds of the cavalry. I told you about the Ironsides, which was that famous armored cavalry that Oliver Cromwell led during the war. Also, they had some of the first armies that fought with muskets, which I think they start with a matchlock musket, which had a fuse where you had to light it, but it was kind of unreliable because if it was raining, the fuse would go out, which was kind of a problem. And some people would even put the fuse under their hat or under the helmet, basically to prevent it from going out. And then, of course, they had the wheel-lock musket, which the wheel-lock musket was kind of like an early flintlock musket, and that's the one that they primarily would use later during the war. They also had infantry that used pikes, which are these long spears that they used in battle, which were usually used against cavalry, is what pikes were used for. The most famous battle fought in, of course, the English Civil War was the Battle of Naseby. It was fought on June 14th, 1646. Later in the week, I'm going to have a documentary I'll show you a clip on, which talks about the Battle of Naseby. And I'll have like an assignment coming up on it. But this famous battle was like one of several battles that were fought during the English Civil War. There was one in 1645 that was called the Battle of Marston Moor. That was fought in the northern part of England, I think in York County, I believe it was. But this one was more decisive, and it was considered a strategic battle because the fact that King Charles's armies were practically destroyed afterwards. And you had like this army where Thomas Fairfax led the so-called New Model Army. It was really their first major battle. They fought this new army. They had about 14,000 troops, and Cromwell led the cavalry, the so-called Ironsides, as they were dubbed. And Charles was kind of there, but he had his famous cavalryman general there. He was well known, named Prince Rupert of the Rhine. He was probably one of the most famous generals that fought in the English Civil War on the royalist side. He was kind of a military genius himself too, but he didn't have enough forces, and they got crushed by the New Model Army. I think they wiped out a majority of their forces, like 2/3 or 3/4 that was wiped out in the battle. And so Charles never recovered. What happened was, after their defeat, Charles was actually captured in 1647. He was imprisoned in England in a bunch of places, and they finally put him, I think, in the Isle of Wight, which is off the coast of England, the southern coast of England. You may have heard of it. He was imprisoned there. They were kind of deciding what they were going to do with Charles. And you know what happened was he escaped. It's like a soap opera. He escaped, and he eventually fled to what is Scotland. He gets to Scotland, and he tries to talk the Scottish into forming an alliance with them, with the Scottish Presbyterians. He told them basically, if you help me get my throne back, what I'll do is I'll allow Presbyterianism to be the main religion, not just in Scotland, but also maybe in England too. And so here you got this religious, reasons why they, fight as well between both sides, England and Scotland. And so you got the Second English Civil War. It kind of breaks out afterwards, 1648 to 49. But the Scots were no match for Cromwell's New Model Army. He took his army into what is northern England. And after the Battle of Preston, which is in 1648, pretty much the royalist type armies and the Scots were pretty much out of it. They pretty much were defeated. That's not Northern Ireland. That should be Northern England, by the way. And anyway, so basically, that's basically the bulk of the end of the English Civil War at that point. And Charles is recaptured again, 1648, basically. And now after that, they have to decide, what are they going to do with King Charles? That's one of the problems that they have, to deal with, is what should they deal with, with him overall. And one of the first things, of course, that happens with, King Charles is they're going to eventually execute him, which, is controversial. One of the most controversial things they probably ever did in British history, early modern times. And after Charles was arrested, what happened was basically the New Model Army and its supporters and all that, they purged what is basically Parliament. They got rid of any kind of members that were basically against what is against putting Charles on trial, maybe leading to his execution and all that. And it was actually called Pride's Purge. Yeah, Pride's Purge, what they usually call it. Yeah, Pride's Purge. And it was known after this guy named Colonel Pride, who was under Oliver Cromwell, one of his officers. And they purged anybody that was against, the New Model Army, like taking over pretty much practically the country. And I forget how many people were in it afterwards, but only a small minority were left over from the original Long Parliament that had been founded in 1640. And it became known, I think it was like 1/6 of it was what was left of the original Long Parliament, the members that were still in it. And after that, it was called the Rump Parliament that basically took over. And so they actually, after that, voted to, execute Charles, who was executed, like I said, January 30th, 1649, is when they, of course, put him to death. pretty much. Now, the English Civil War wasn't over yet. It wasn't. They still kind of kept fighting, after that. And there was a third one. There was a so-called Third English Civil War, which mostly took place about 1649 to 51. It's about when it was. That one was the Oliver Cromwell and the New Model Army versus Prince Charles, who later is called Charles II, the son of Charles I. And he basically went into Scotland and declared himself king of Scotland. He wanted, the English throne back at that point. And so Cromwell, took his army up into Scotland again, like up in England, northern England and Scotland again, invaded again. But Prince Charles, if you know about it, escaped. He wasn't able to capture him. I think he was going to probably capture and have him killed also as well. And we'll get to it later. I'll talk about the story later. But Charles hid in like an oak tree to escape being captured, which just became kind of a famous thing later if you read about it. So he escapes, and he'll, I think, later flee back to France and all that, and because the French were kind of helping the Stuarts try to get power back and all that, during that time. But he'll get the throne back eventually after the Cromwells are gone, when the Stuarts are restored in 1660 and all that. So let me talk about what happened after that. Now, of course, after they killed Charles I off, like executed Charles in 1649, what happens after that? England then converts to a republic. That's something that's very true about this time. That it's in fact the only time in British history that they have a republican state that they have actually at one point. So it's called different names. They call it the Commonwealth, or Commonwealth of England, or Commonwealth of Britain is one name they called it. Some people call it the Protectorate period in British history, which is around 10 years or so, a decade. And also they call it the Interregnum period, or Interregnum for short, 1649 to 1660, kind of between, the monarchs in power and all that. What ends up happening is Cromwell practically takes over the country by the 1650s. He's practically like a dictator, political dictator, although more like a Republican head of state is, I guess, what he officially is, pretty much. And he went by different titles. I've got a little short video I'll kind of show you on Cromwell, but it kind of goes into detail about a little bit about him. So I'll kind of show you a little short video on Cromwell.
After the execution of Charles I, England was a republic. Look at what happened to the design of the Great Seal, the official mark on statutes and proclamations.
Here's Charles's seal, the seal of a king. He canters on horseback with his greyhound running alongside, and the Latin motto means Charles, by the grace of God, King of Great Britain, France and Scotland, defender of the faith.
After his execution, the new republic was in theory ruled by the House of Commons. So instead of a king's seal, the Great Seal was the seal of the House of Commons.
It shows the Commonwealth, a map of Britain, and on the other side are the Commons themselves. And the motto simply says, 1651, in the third year of freedom by God's blessing restored.
In English. Didn't last, though, because the real power wasn't the House of Commons. It was the army.
For a while, the army was too busy to take much notice of England. It was occupied with the destruction of Ireland, where a large part of the population were irredeemably loyal to Catholicism and the monarchy. But when it finally turned round and looked at England, it found that there still hadn't been a thoroughgoing Puritan Revolution. So, in 1653, Cromwell, the army's most powerful general, cleared the Commons at sword point and installed a new parliament, which he thought would be more capable of bringing about a revolutionary transformation of society. His own Chamber of Righteous Puritans, the so-called nominated Parliament, turned out to be no more to his liking, and he dismissed that too, installing himself as the Lord Protector. And the Great Seal was now his own. It shows Oliver Cromwell on horseback, just like Charles, but stepping out very stately rather than cantering with a greyhound. And the motto says,
"By the grace of God, the Republic of England, Scotland and Ireland, and the Protector Oliver,"
in Latin. In what sense was this a republic? However unwillingly, and he kept protesting his unwillingness, Cromwell was driven by his own belief in the divine right of revolution to run the country as a militarized kingdom for Puritan saints. There were now 11 districts, each run not by the people, but by major generals. These military ayatollahs collected taxes, ran the courts, and controlled public morality.
Theatres were closed along with brothels and gambling dens. Horse racing and cockfights were banned. Everyone had to go to church, stay sober and morally upright. Pagan festivities, like Christmas, were banned. Mince pies were forbidden. Oh, it must have been great.
In 1656, a newly elected Parliament made it clear they wanted to return to the old constitution. They reopened the House of Lords and offered Cromwell the title of King. He seriously considered it. And although he turned it down, perhaps because the army would have turned against him, 2 years later, on his deathbed, he nominated his eldest surviving son as his successor, like any other king.
So anyway, they look almost like a king, really. Oliver Cromwell, of course, with that. So yeah, Cromwell was not a popular ruler. He was like a dictator, pretty much running the country. And yeah, he was Lord Protector was his common title that he went by. He was also called Head of State, I think was another common title that he ruled by. There was even talk, like I said, of him becoming king, like King Oliver was kind of kicked around also as well. So yeah, Cromwell was not popular. The Puritanism was pushed on everybody. That's why the Globe Theater was shut down and never reopened, of course, because of what happened with the Puritans, taking over the country and all that. They talked about Ireland. He, of course, at one point did invade Ireland, Cromwell, with his New Mile army to force them to kind of be part of the Commonwealth as well. And he was known for sacking a lot of Irish cities like Wexford, Drogheda, of course, were destroyed practically, where they killed thousands of men, women, and children. And so Cromwell is not a very popular man still today in Ireland. They hate him because of him going over there. And so he was known for committing mass genocide against the Irish people, and all that. Yeah, his son took over also as well. I think I've got a slide on him a little bit. He had a son named Richard Cromwell who reigned until about 1658 to 59. So he was basically nominated by Oliver to take his place. Oliver Cromwell died of natural causes. And so he came in as well and was Lord Protector for about 9 months. And he had the backing of the military at first, but apparently he fell out of favor with them. And I think there was talk of bringing back the monarch, the monarch at that point, the Stuart dynasty and all that. And so he was deposed in a coup d'etat in 1659 and was overthrown. And the royalists, after they took over later, called Richard Cromwell, called him Tumble Down Dick or Queen Dick, which were kind of like nicknames saying that he was basically a weak ruler. So it was almost like he was a king, more or less setting himself up like Oliver Cromwell was, but not in official theory anyway. Now I'm going to talk about it later, but what's going to happen is the Stuart dynasty is going to get reestablished. I'll talk about this, of course, on Thursday, but the Stuart dynasty is going to come back in. You'll see they call it the Restoration, or the so-called Stuart Restoration. And of course, what's going to happen is you'll have, of course, King Charles the Second will come in. That king I told you about that Oliver Cromwell did not capture. And so he'll come back basically later, take over in 1660. So I'll talk about the Stuart dynasty. I'll get into and talk about he and his brother James II, who's the last Catholic monarch they have in Britain. I'll talk about the Glorious Revolution and Queen Anne, and then I'll kind of go into, and I'll talk about, I'll kind of get into talk about just briefly some of the later dynasties that they have in British history, like the Hanover dynasty. I'll get into that one. And I'll also talk about the House of Windsor that they have. I'll kind of talk about some of those later modern ones we have now that ruled up to the 20th, and the current ruler now, of course, Queen Elizabeth II. So anyway, before I go today, I want to remind y'all, don't forget, we do have some, assignments still posted that y'all need to kind of, work on. Mostly the first exam, of course, the big thing that you need to get done this week. I'll probably have it open till like Thursday or Friday for you to kind of wrap that up, that assignment. Of course, that second VOGAB is still up too as well, which will be up for a couple weeks after that. That'll be due later in the month overall. And don't forget, I did send out reminders about makeups. If you missed an assignment this semester, there should be some kind of email I sent to you about that. But I guess nobody has any other questions today. But if you have any comments, questions about this lecture, let me know through my channel. Anytime you want, ask me a question about this one or a previous lecture, let me know. And I'll see you later this week. I will have a later assignment coming up about, of course, the English Civil War. It's a documentary about it. I'll kind of show you a video clip of it, not today. I didn't have time, but I'll show it to you on, of course, Thursday's lecture. So y'all take care and have a good rest of the week. Okay?